Well, it seems that the rain did not dampen any determination for you to attend today's researcher talk. So thank you for braving the elements. I'm Richard McCulley, the historian at the Center for Legislative Archives, the sponsor of this series. Today's program is the third researcher talk this year. Next month, we pick up the pace a bit. On May 19th, George Yin, a professor of law and taxation at the University of Virginia Law School and a former chief of staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation, will speak about his research and that committee's records and the history of the Joint Committee. And on May 26th, we host Magdalena Krajewska, professor of political science at Wingate University, who will discuss her research for her book manuscript about the politics of national identification documents in the United States in the 20th century. An important mission of the Center is promoting scholars' research in the records of the Senate and the House of Representatives and advancing the study of the history of Congress. This Researcher Talk series helps the Center gauge how fully that mission is being met, and we do so by regularly hosting scholars who have conducted research in House and Senate records or who have written significant books on the history of Congress. In today's much anticipated talk, we hear about one of those very significant books on the history of Congress. Our guest, Charles Stewart, gave a marvelous research talk last November on a book that he co-authored with Wendy Schiller, Electing the Senate Indirect Democracy Before the 17th Amendment. At that time, the battle over who would succeed the Speaker was finally dying down, and Charles graciously agreed to return this year to discuss the history of electing the Speaker of the House. He has given today's talk the enticing title, Speaker Battles Then and Now, a talk informed by a book co-authored with Jeffrey Jenkins, Fighting for the Senate, the House, and the Rise of Party Government, which I highly, highly recommend. Charles, a longtime friend of the Center, is the Kenan Sahin Distinguished Professor of Political Science at MIT, where he has taught since 1985. He is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In addition to the two books I've already mentioned, Charles is also the author of a wonderful textbook, Analyzing Congress, and editor with Garrison Nelson of the indispensable two-volume Committees in the United States Congress. Thank you very much for being here today with us, Charles, and letting us host you. We should have a few minutes for Q&A after the presentation, but before you ask a question, please raise your hand so we can pass the microphone and you can be heard. Thank you, Charles.
So thanks, Richard, and it's great to be here. Again, as Richard was saying, a few months ago I was going to be giving a talk about actually a more recent book with Wendy Schiller about Senate elections before the 17th Amendment, right as the John Boehner was eventually swept off the stage. And I suggested to Richard that, well, maybe I should talk about Speaker elections. And he said, no, why don't you talk about the Senate as advertised? So, but you can come back next year. So that's what I'm doing here. And when I was here last time, I also just had to say that, and I'll repeat it this time, that it's a real thrill to be speaking here. Richard didn't mention that my first book, which was about budget reform, the history of budget reform, basically was written in this building when I was a graduate student first as a dissertation and then later on. So this was in the early 1980s, back when you got off, as I mentioned last time, when you got off the Archives Metro stop, you just hightailed it as fast as you could across the street because it was a very different neighborhood 30, 40 years ago than it is today. You couldn't go across the street and sit in French bakeries and eat croissant and all those sorts of things. It was quite, I think it was the Canadians who upped the the quality of the neighborhood down the street. So in any case, it's really great to be here. It's also really interesting in these talks to be reminded that although in my life as a congressional historian, I do my work because I just love the stories and find it really interesting, and have helped to build a subfield of congressional history within the field of political science, which, as you will discover, is quite different than what it would look like if it were in the field of history. We study these things because we love them. There's great stories. They've largely not been told, and history these days doesn't like to tell stories about political institutions. We can complain about history, some of us, the field these days, if we'd like. But the neat thing is that I've discovered that these books actually become relevant. And so when I was talking about the passage of the 17th Amendment and how elections happened before the 17th Amendment, when I got into that project, I didn't realize that there would become a movement actually to repeal the 17th Amendment and to go back to the state legislatures. In fact, Ted Cruz favors repealing the 17th Amendment. And so it's become might become a current topic. And then likewise, when I first started thinking about writing about the speakership, it was due to just antiquarian interest. And some other interests that I'll talk about, and actually it may in fact have some currency itself. So what I'm going to be talking about is speakership battles, or how and why did the parties stop airing their dirty laundry on the floor, and what does that teach us about today? I'm mostly going to be talking about the book that Richard so nicely advertised for us. And then I realized when I was putting together the talk that although I would have much preferred to kind of do the play-by-play announcement for more recent speakership battles, it turns out that I think that since no one knows the old battles, that it might be useful just to give the historical context and then come back at the end and say a bit about why the degree to which current battles over the speakership share features with the past, and to the degree to which actually there are really, one can easily make bad comparisons to the past as well. So my interest in, and then by the way, I should just note, for those of you who are really interested in this, Jeff Jenkins and I have 2 Monkey Cage blog posts in the last year where we do try to bring together the fight over, for Boehner to retain his seat, and these older stories I'll be telling you about. If you just Google Monkey Cage, Stuart Jenkins speaker, you can find these on the Washington Post site. So my interest in speakership battles, as well as actually interest in Senate elections, came as a graduate student. When I started reading a little bit into the history of Congress, there wasn't actually a whole lot about the history of Congress back when I was starting in graduate school, but I discovered that there had been battles before the Civil War for the speakership. This is the picture from our cover of our book. This is the celebration in the election of Nathaniel Banks as Speaker in 1855. And I discovered that it was quite common not only to have uncertainty about who the Speaker might be upon the convening of Congress, but that there could be battles on the House floor that would go on for days and weeks and months, and this just seemed really cool. And exactly the sort of thing that you want to take on after you get tenure, not before. So I got tenure, and I got to do these fun things. And so I started to piece together the history, and Frederick Muhlenberg was the first speaker, and it turned out that although it wasn't nearly as sexy or as exciting an election as Nathaniel Banks, nonetheless the very first speaker had to endure a multi-ballot contest in order to be elected the speaker. So, and so it turns out that it used to be very, very common, not just the famous cases of Nathaniel Banks, but very common in the antebellum period to have multiple ballots for elections and actually to have real, honest-to-goodness fights. And I'll come back to that. Then when I started, coincidence, Denny Hastert was Speaker of the House when I started this project, and fast forward to the present. Although maybe this might be a little more, for some of you this would be more pleasant, for others of you this would be more pleasant picture. But when I started the project, if you were to fast forward to the present, you would see quite a different story. You would see almost a kabuki theater set of performances upon the convening of every House of Representatives every 2 years, where somebody leading the majority party would nominate someone for speaker, and someone from the minority party would nominate someone for speaker. Then there would be a vote, and surprise, surprise, all the D's would vote for the D and Democrat, and all the R's would vote for the Republican, and whoever had the majority in the chamber would win, and everyone would go off and have drinks and celebrate and be happy. Or actually, rather, then what would happen would be a series of resolutions that would, in short order, elect the clerk, well, no longer the printer, but elect the officers of the House, and then very soon after that, elect the committees. Very, 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 very simple. And that there would be caucuses ahead of time to nominate the two parties, but it would be leaders, but it would be very well known who these nominees would be. And if there were disagreements, and there have been disagreements, and there have been some fights for leadership of the parties, but they've all been contained within the party, within the caucus. Okay, so once the caucus decides, then things move on. That was the world of Denny Hastert. That was the world, basically, for everybody in this room, in our lifetimes, that was basically the story. Nancy Pelosi, getting closer to actually our book being done a decade later, Pelosi began to run into trouble. And I'll come back to this. I hope I'll have time. In fact, I will have time. I'll make time for it. But many of you will recall that after the shellacking the Democrats took in 2010, and actually in the run-up to that election, there was active talk among many Democrats, especially the Blue Dog Democrats, that Nancy Pelosi has to go. There was a bit of a rebellion within the Democratic Party that she survived, but nonetheless, if the Democrats had held the House in 2010, the story could have been very, very different. By the time we rolled into finishing our book, John Boehner had been elected Speaker, and storm clouds were on the horizon. And then, as has been mentioned several times, well, here you go. Here's his second election as Speaker, and we see that John Boehner got a bunch of votes, and Nancy Pelosi got a bunch of votes, and then a bunch of other people got a bunch of votes. And all these stars are next to Republicans. Okay, so this old world has begun to fray. And this was even before last year when a group within the Tea Party started circulating a petition to declare the chair of the House vacant and basically to depose Boehner. Okay, so this was, it didn't happen, of course. Paul Ryan got to be Speaker. But nonetheless, you know, that would have been really, really quite different if Ryan, y'all will recall the speculation about Ryan. And although a lot of work happened behind the scenes, you know, there was a big chance that if Ryan hadn't taken the position, it could have been chaos. Okay, and we haven't seen that in a long, long time. Okay, so it's a new world, and what I want to come back to at the end of this talk is the degree to which the really old world can help to inform the new world. Okay, so very quickly, let me first of all just give you an overview of what happens in this book, which, by the way, is probably the last 450-page book ever to be published in political science. We start in the earliest years with the speakership being decided in contests that are quasi-partisan, by which I mean political parties grew up in the early period of the Republic, but in the earliest days, the earliest few decades, and I'll give some specifics in just a bit, there weren't caucuses in the way that we understand them now, and so there was oftentimes uncertainty, even with one of the parties had a majority about who the speaker would be, and once the speaker was decided, it wasn't necessarily determined who would be on the committees, who would have other positions, et cetera. Eventually, and early in the antebellum period, speakership contests became structured around partisanship and around ideology. And this is kind of in the late antebellum period where the really fun fights happen. And in these circumstances, there are still informal caucuses, so they're not the types of caucuses we have right now. And it wasn't always clear what the implications of a speaker being chosen were. And it certainly wasn't an expectation that the caucus nominee would be supported by everybody in the party. Nonetheless, it became partisan in the antebellum period. The really important thing, this is the world that most of us have lived through. Actually, all of us have lived through this, because after the Civil War, with some very interesting timing, and a couple of times during the Civil War, after the Civil War, the organization of the House became very, very regular. And it became regular in such a way that Jeff and I refer to this as a cartel, by which not only did the majority party control, not only control all of the offices, but that expectations fell from that the majority party actually would control legislation in the House. And that depended on there being certainty that the majority caucus would come to the defense of the nominee for Speaker. And once that happened, the world was really different. And that's the world that may or may not be unraveling. Okay? And this is a world that was built up in the period from the Civil War up until the speakership of one of the most famous speakers, for those of you who aren't professional Congress geeks, Speaker Reed. And that is basically three-decade period. Okay, so it grows up and becomes really mature in the early 20th century. Okay, so that's the general. Oh, and then one last thing. We discover in the process of writing the book that the speaker was the tip of the iceberg, just in terms of the story. Because one of the things we didn't expect, we just thought we would be telling a bunch of, kind of knock-down, drag-out, rock'em sock'em robot fights about the speakership. And what we discovered was, in the antebellum period, that there were other offices. And oftentimes, those offices were as important, if not more important, to the members of the House than the speakership. And in many ways, may be more important for the development of parties than the speakership at various times. And those include the printer, those include the clerk, those include the sergeant-at-arms. And in fact, once there was even a fight over who the chaplain was going to be. At least once I found a chaplain deposed in a partisan. So there's a lot of just interesting stuff, especially in the antebellum. And this is really where, when we talk about the development of party government, that this agglomeration of offices in the antebellum period are in the eye of Martin Van Buren, who's America's great party thinker. And he has a theory about how you can knit all these things together and you can control national politics. So it's not just the speaker, it's everything. Okay? Here's this is a vision test. I used to be able to read this, but there's a table of contents in the book. You can, there's a bunch of appendices. So for those of you who do buy the book or look at the book, if you're really interested in this era, not only do we have kind of blow-by-blow chapters really focusing on the pre-Civil War, and then we have post-Civil War, one chapter for the post-Civil War period that tells you something about these fights. But we have a bunch of appendices. So if you're interested in all the balloting for all these offices that I just told you about, including the speaker, we have the numbers, we have sources. Likewise, we've gone through and we've actually collected sources and numbers about the caucus battles. So where the speakers came from, and et cetera. So it's all in there. Relying on a bunch of data sources, standard historical ones, the various recordings, the journals, and the debates, as well as the party and other newspapers during this period. So it's primarily a documentary study. Unfortunately, not too much in the archives, this archives. So let me just very quickly, then this is kind of the rest of the talk. I'll probably skip over kind of the political science part, why this is important. Do an overview, another slightly more detailed overview of the speaker elections. Probably jump over talking about clerks and printers and viva voce voting, and then get to the 9 critical elections, which I think help to inform how we think about the problem that John Boehner had and that Ryan has had. So why study this? One of the things I just want to note is that there's a number of questions intellectually about studying speakership fights. Some of them are we could just call them purely historical, just a lot of really interesting empirical questions. There's There are larger issues as well that I've already talked on. For instance, there are still questions remaining about the evolution of party government in America. Parties are not in the Constitution, as you know. They have to be built, and knitting that together. I have, by the way, one of my little movements, being a fan of the presidency, is that there is something in American politics known as the presidential synthesis of American politics. And I want to build the congressional synthesis of American politics. And I think there is meat here for the building of that congressional synthesis. Then finally, this is kind of the political science-y question, but it's a really hard question. You know, embedded in how we elect speakers is a type of election that we're about to see in Cleveland. And that election form is majority requirement, okay? No entry barriers. How do those get resolved if no one has a majority? Okay? So you have a hung convention at Cleveland. How does that get resolved? Well, speakership is the same thing. To get elected speaker, you need a majority of the chamber. Anyone can be nominated. You can vote for anybody. If there's a deadlock, how do you resolve that? It's a really hard question theoretically, as well as practically. A couple of possible unifying stories. Actually, I will skip over that because you don't want to see political science. You probably want to hear more about the fights. So let me give you now a little more on the chronology of the period. We break down the period into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 periods. The first period up to 1811 is the pre-institutional period. It's the period of John Muhlenberg, ends with Speaker Varnum. There's usually 1 or 2 ballots. All of these will have some speakers for a while. This is the number of ballots. We actually don't know. It's not even in the journal how many ballots there were in the first couple of Congresses. Newspapers have some accounts. So we have the number of ballots, who the speakers were. Informal nomination. Sometimes the majority party gets the speakership, sometimes not. You know, I wouldn't say lackadaisical, but it's not as high-powered as and as focused as it becomes later on, especially after the 12th Congress and the rise of Henry Clay. So again, Henry Clay is one of the great monumental figures, not only in not just in American history writ large, but in the institutional development of the House of Representatives. And Clay comes in, becomes Speaker, and makes a number of institutional changes to turn the House into kind of a proto-incipient version of what we see now, by which I mean committees that are standing committees and strong speaker controlling the floor and those sorts of things. During this period, Clay allows people to see the value of a strong presiding officer, and the speakership becomes more valuable for individual politicians and for the parties. However, without very strong parties during this period, Clay is able to get elected speaker because of the force of personality, maybe, I don't know. There's a lot of reasons. Actually, I still am kind of puzzled why Clay always gets elected speaker so easily. He comes and goes. He has gambling debts. He goes and negotiates treaties. And whenever he leaves during this period, you can see Clay shows up from time to time. He leaves, for instance, in the middle of the 16th Congress, and Taylor gets elected speaker. It takes 22 ballots to elect Clay's replacement. Clay comes back, and then Barber, the next Congress, 12 ballots. Clay comes back in, he's right back in. Taylor, again, 2 ballots. So there's no guarantee that things are going to be resolved really quickly if you're not Henry Clay. Okay. Interesting thing happens in 1839. Before 1839, balloting for speaker was by secret ballot. If I have time, and if I don't have time, maybe in the Q&A I can talk about this. In 1839, the House starts voting the way they do now, viva voce, live voice, out loud. Okay? And that changes a lot. Okay? The most obvious thing is we now know how individual members of Congress, of the House, are voting. If you're a constituent, you can observe this. If you're a party leader, you can observe this. You can imagine how it's going to change the dynamics. And this period from 39 to 65 is the one that has the many deadlocks, and the most famous ones. So you can see, when Cobb was elected in the 31st Congress, Banks, 133 ballots. Cobb, 63. Pennington, 44. And on and on. Okay. twice, in 31st Congress, 34th Congress, there are motions to adjourn the House and just wait for the next elections. Probably the only time in American history, recall if you read your Constitution, the House couldn't do that, right? Because they can't adjourn unless the Senate says it's okay. And that's probably the only time in American history where that provision actually really mattered. So the Senate would have said, no, you got to work this one out. And so they never, but imagine this, on the eve of what became the Civil War, Congress almost said, well, let's just go home. We can't solve this. Okay. After the Civil War, things really change. You don't see any numbers by these speakers. Okay. So no more multi-ballot affairs after the Civil War. Parties begin to nominate speakers in formal caucuses. It becomes a binding caucus. There then becomes a question about whether the new arrangement will stick, and it does. And we're off to the races. After 1991, so just to talk about the transition for a second, 1891, Speaker Reed, again, an important moment in the history of Congress when Speaker Reed basically codifies, both by force of personality, by theory of party government, and by some changes in the rules, really codifies the control of the floor by the majority party leadership. Okay. So you now have kind of this bundle of a nominating caucus where the majority party works out its problems privately. They come to an agreement about who's going to lead. The vanquished get really good committee assignments or other promises, and you go to the floor unified. And that's basically the form, that's kind of the system that we think we still have right now in 1891. So after 1891, it's pretty much one ballot, except for 1923, when there was a progressive stalwart split, 9 ballots to elect Frederick Gillette in 1923. That's the episode that's been seen as being the most parallel, possibly, to what Boehner did experience and that Ryan may experience in the next Congress. But other than 1923, caucuses have made nominations and they've gone through with the majority party winning. Okay. What is this? This is not a seismogram from Oklahoma these days. This is just a visual that's in the book, and let me explain it to you. Don't need to know the details to kind of get the importance of the visual. This line right here, so this line right here reflects how many seats the majority party has in the House of Representatives from the first Congress up into the 112th Congress. The solid line, the dark line, is the fraction of votes received by the top vote getter from the majority party in the first round of voting for the Speaker. And you'll notice up till here, it's pretty erratic, oftentimes less than 1, which indicates that oftentimes the majority party couldn't get everybody to vote for a single person. You'll notice that things start getting calm around 1870, and it's been pretty calm ever since. And the fact that you don't, this solid line doesn't get up totally to 1 is not because of defections, but it's usually just because of absences. Okay, things like that. This is a slightly different graph, but this is the Boehner problem and the Ryan problem, which kind of puts it in context. It is the biggest divergence from the expectation since the Civil War, with the one exception of 1923. So this is a big deal. This is a really big deal. Okay. I'm going to skip over clerks, printers, and others, and you can just believe me that they were really important and interesting. I'd be love to, or you can buy the book and find out about that. This is a but this is a visualization just to kind of show just visually where the conflicts are. So each column is a Congress from the 1st down to the 115th. And this row is, shows us what happened. Oh, there you go. When Speaker elections kind of blew up, when clerk elections blew up, when printer elections blew up. And you can see that this comes up to the 1850s, and then lots of blowing up, all up and down the line. Starting at the 37th Congress, there's only one colored, and that's Sell, and that's that 1923 case. So things are really, really different. I will also skip over viva voce, except to say this. If you want to read the slide, you may while I talk. The importance about viva voce is that I think it's one of the great examples of unintended consequences in reforms in Congress in history. The intention of viva voce was to overcome reneging on promises in the election of the subsidiary officers, particularly the clerk and the printer, where this really became an issue. So Van Buren and other party leaders decided that the solution to reneging on promises was to open up voting in public, so we can observe if someone reneges. And in the short term, it worked wonders. We got almost a really high spike in party loyalty in these elections. A problem. So did newspaper editors also started noticing, and citizens started noticing. Right at the moment that the nation is beginning to get divided along slavery and other issues. And so back in the olden days, you might be, if you were from the South, you might be able to vote for someone from the North, and then just claim to your constituents, must have been somebody else who voted for that guy, it wasn't me. You can't do that anymore. And in a heightened ideological environment, it becomes much, much harder to put together coalitions within parties. Okay? And that becomes the really important thing. Plus, we get a bunch of data. And being a political scientist, I like getting data. Let me talk about, so there's a bunch of over 115 elections for Speaker in American politics. There are 9 that I think are particularly worth noting. I'm not going to go through all the details here, but just note that just really, really quickly, there's a couple of general patterns here. The first one that I would note is the election of 1839, which took 11 ballots over 2 days, and Robert Hunter ended up being elected Speaker. The story here was that going into the election, nobody quite knew which party had a majority to begin with. But layered on top of this, there was an infamous disputed election in New Jersey, which elected their members at large. And it would be the outcome of this, that disputed election that would determine whether the Whigs or the Democrats had the majority. It took 2 weeks just to decide what to do with that disputed election. The Democrats eventually won that fight, and then it took another 2 weeks to decide who was going to be Speaker. Okay. Hunter, who gets elected because the Democrats, although they end up having a majority, are not very good at counting votes. So Hunter was a Whig, although the Democrats had a majority. So the outcome here was just simple vote counting problem. For 1849 and 1855, these are the real Donnybrooks. 61 ballots over 3 weeks, where Howell Cobb was eventually elected. 34th Congress, 113 ballots over 2 months, in which Nathaniel Banks was elected. The gist of these elections were that all these two were three-cornered affairs. And if other Congresses had been basically closely allied, or the numbers had been close, they also would have been three-quarter affairs. By which I mean there were Whigs or some opposition to the Democrats. So you had the Democrats, and then you would have the Free Soil Party. Okay, so anti-slavery, and then the Democrats and whoever was opposing the Democrats had northern and southern wings. And so you would basically have this divisions between party and then over slavery. And that is inherently an unstable mix in a majority voting. And in both of these cases, the House eventually decided to select their Speaker through plurality vote. Only time in history. That's the only way they could get out of the conundrum. In 36, now we're coming into the Civil War, Pennington from New Jersey gets elected. Here, it's actually kind of interesting. I mean, it's very, very different and much more, actually much more easy to understand. By 36, 36th Congress, slavery was basically the issue. And everyone was arrayed along some continuum about how strongly you felt about slavery. With the Democrats basically being a pro-slavery party by then, the Republicans and the opposition party and kind of a dog stew of other parties who were not Democrats arrayed against slavery. And here the issue ended up being that a group of, let's call them Republicans just to make it easy, who were not quite as anti-slavery as the others, started playing chicken. They would vote for the Democrats in a series of battles in order to try to move the Republican Party kind of more to the left, away from the strident anti-slavery movements. The Democrats noticed this. And unbeknownst to the Republicans, on one day, there were these like 6 guys playing chicken, voting for Democrats, trying to kind of play a mind game on the Republican leadership. The Democrats, with a few of the American Party, which is pivotal here, they all ganged up and voted for the same Democrat. And it was almost, they almost grabbed the speakership away from the majority. Ended up not happening. Pennington ends up getting the speakership. He is a more moderate Republican than the person that Republicans have been trying to get to be Speaker. 37th Congress is really important because this breaks the pattern of airing dirty laundry on the floor. What happens in the 37th Congress? So this is right as the Civil War is starting. Republicans come into town. They decide not to have a caucus. But what the leaders agreed to do is that there will be a ballot, whichever Republican, on the House floor, whichever Republican gets the most votes. On the second ballot, the Republicans will all vote for him. Okay? So Galusha Grow comes in. He gets the most votes. It's not a majority. However, on the very next move, the fellow who came in second, and I will, that's Frank Blair, actually the son of one of the printers who we saw a few decades ago. Enough people who had voted for Blair changed their votes so that Grow gets a majority and no multi-ballot affair. Okay? And that kind of knocks the legs out under multi-ballot affairs. So from that time forward, the question becomes after the Civil War whether the caucuses will hold on the floor. The first real test becomes in oh, by the way, I should mention, it's 1865 when the first time both the Democratic and the Republican caucus both come to the floor and make a nomination. And so you can maybe time the modern era from 1865. 1876 is the first Congress when the Democrats regain control of the House after the Civil War. So there's a question about whether the Democrats are going to do what the Republicans did, which is to resolve things within the caucus, give out goodies to the people who were vanquished, and then go to the floor united. They did. 47 and 52 ended up being caucus fights within the Republican Party and the Democratic Party in which the parties were divided in 3, 4, 5, 7-way contests where there was a question. People were just so ticked off at the end of both of these contests that there was a question about whether the losers would come and vote for the winner on the floor. And they did in both cases. Okay, so this was the biggest test, the stress test up until 1891 when, so that's the stress test. So really the last time the whole system fell apart was in 1923. And just to give you a really quick overview, because we have probably about 5 more minutes of me talking and then questions. 1923 you will recognize as being in a period in which the Republican Party was divided between stalwarts, kind of conservatives. They weren't called stalwarts by then, but basically conservatives, which was the largest group of the party, and the progressives. And the Republicans had taken a shellacking in the 1922 election. And so the progressives ended up being, there were about 24 of them. There was only a 14-vote majority for the Republicans. They wanted the leadership of the Republican Party to be more open, and they demanded this of the Republican leadership. Nicholas Longworth, who eventually got a building named after him, said, "No way. You'll do what I say." And the progressives said, "Okay, fine. See you on the floor." Basically, it was a game of just staring, a staring contest for 3 days, and eventually the progressives won. Of course, the threat kind of behind the door that the progressives could conceivably go over and organize the chamber with the Democrats. Culturally, they never would have. There's a lot of reasons why you wouldn't expect that to happen, but that was there, possible, ideologically possible. Progressives eventually won, and they got some changes to the House rules. In the 24 election, much better for Republicans. Progressives are no longer pivotal. Longworth was now Speaker. He took everything back. He punished the progressives. If you had a really good committee assignment, you were taken off that committee. In the 24 election, you also, if you supported La Follette, the progressive candidate, you're out of the party. If you don't vote for me, you're out of the party. So by 26, all the progressives had were back in the party, and they came along. Okay, so and I would say that that was the period. We would say that's the period where this practice of who you vote for Speaker determines which party you're in really begins. That norm begins then. If you don't vote for the Speaker candidate, you're not in the party. Get someone else to give you committee assignments. Okay, so very quickly, there's two types of stalemates, right? We have the three-cornered stalemates. Before the Civil War, we have a big party, a little party, who are organized along some major dimension, and a third party in there, like the Free Soilers, who want to do something else. Whereas there's another pattern that we saw with the progressives, we saw a few times in the antebellum period, where you have two parties, and you have what we call the pivotal insurgents, like the progressives. Okay, so those are the two. So Pelosi's problem, here's just a few graphs, but I'll just tell you what these graphs are intended to say. Nancy Pelosi had problems, as I mentioned earlier, in the 2010 election with the so-called Blue Dog Democrats, who ran against her in the general. Now, the Democrats had their own shellacking in 2010, so it wasn't like she was nominated for Speaker. But at the end of the day, there was a revolt against her continued leadership in the caucus. She lost something like 43 votes in the caucus. 43 people voted against her in the caucus. And 11 members voted against her on the floor for Speaker, voted for Heath Shuler and some others. This just shows ideologically, using a common measure of ideology. This is the left, this is the right. Republicans are all over here. The red dots are where the people who voted against Pelosi were. So they are the most conservative Democrats. Okay. Interesting thing here is that this is the ideological location of everybody who left the Congress in the 2010 election on the Democratic side. This is intended to remind us that one of the things the 2010 election did was remove even more conservative Democrats from the Democratic caucus. So if the Democrats had organized in 2010, I think Pelosi would have been in deep trouble, or the Democrats would have been in deep trouble. Okay. John Boehner, we all know, had problems. This is a similar picture to this one, which shows the ideological location of everybody who voted against Boehner. It's on his far right. Okay, so there's certainly an ideological mapping to Boehner's problems. Okay. Ryan's problems. This is Paul Ryan's problem, and this is thanks to Keith Poole in his VoteView blog from a few days ago. Keith did an interesting plot, which he plots every member of the House of Representatives, the D's are the Democrats, the R's are Republicans, by this measure that he produces of ideology. So these are the liberals, these are the conservatives. The y-axis is how many votes members got in the last election. And Poole does the following exercise. He says, what if this is as bad an election for Republicans as people can imagine? Not that he's saying it will be, but what if? So he says, well, what happens if there's just a 7-point swing away from the Republican Party in 2016 for House elections? If so, then these Republicans lose. Okay. Now, this would be an extreme swing. Republicans still have a majority, but it might only be like 10 seats. Look at who stays. The more ideological, the further to the right you are, the more likely you are to stay. Okay, so Ryan's best hope is still not going to be happy times. when it comes to organizing it. But what Keith doesn't say is that, if things get even better for the Democrats, and there's some miracle the Democrats take the House, the Democrats who come in are likely to be the conservative Democrats. So Nancy Pelosi or whoever the Democratic nominee is going to be also and not in a good shape either because of these ideological battles. So just to wrap up, considering the past and thinking about the future in the next few years. So we think about the current conflicts over the speakership. There is no evidence so far that members want to upset what I call the organizational cartel. That is, there is no evidence that members want to really give up the system where the parties organize things internally. The question is whether they can keep the system going together. I think there's an argument that if you just kind of look at the types of, very abstractly, the types of contests that happened, especially before the Civil War, and map those types onto the current conundrums for the Democrats and the Republicans, that actually it's the Democrats who have the bigger problem. Because the Democrats who would defect from a nominee are conservative Democrats. They could plausibly walk over to the Republican Party and organize with the Republicans. Not that it would happen, but they can make that credible threat. Whereas Tea Party Republicans, what Keith Poole calls the suicide caucus, it's his terms, not mine, they have nowhere ideologically to go. They cannot credibly say, if you don't capitulate, we'll vote with the Democrats to organize. So it's more likely that the Republican caucus is going to be like the Democrats used to be. Remember the old saying, not a member of an organized political party, I'm a Democrat? Well, now that's true of the Republican Party, and that may in fact end up being the case. Democrats have more to lose on the floor. Some other things to think about, though, is that some of the ways in which the present are really different from the antebellum periods are these 2 points. First of all, there's presently no third force in American politics, right? So it's the three-cornered contests that are the most vexing. And so if there were a third force, like Donald Trump starts his own party, then things could get really, really nasty. But there isn't. And actually, election laws in the states make it really hard for third parties to come along. And then finally, the party rules, and this is a little bit inside baseball, but I think it's really important. Party rules are really different now. Back in the olden days, nominations were made the night before the Congress convened. Now, especially Republicans, actually both Democrats and Republicans now, meet right after the election to decide who they're going to nominate for Speaker. So they have 2 months to figure this out. The Republicans furthermore have a rule which says that to nominate, we'll start balloting. If we have a bunch of people who want to be Speaker, we'll take a vote. Person on the bottom gets dropped off. And then we'll vote again. Person on the bottom gets dropped off. So they actually have a rule that eventually gets down to a two-person contest and picks somebody. So there are rules that are very, very different than in the past. And then finally, I just have to mention, back to the brokered convention. We may have a trial run at old-style nomination speaker fight politics in Cleveland this summer. Because as I mentioned before, a brokered convention in many ways is the same thing as a speakership fight. So thank you. Be happy to take questions.
Please raise your hand if you have a question.
Karl-Henrik Geschwind, a fascinating talk. I'm again wondering about some of the comparative situations here. I'm thinking of the British system, where you also have obviously greater stakes. The person who gets voted on is not just the speaker, but is the prime minister. But there it's not just that you organize the House of Commons with that election, you also determine policy.
Right.
And how far do you actually have party government in the American Congress, where you may organize the House, but you still don't have assurance that you can get your policy through? I'm thinking of my particular area, tax policy. There are lots of cases where both the chairman of the Ways and Means and the House Speaker want something, but the parties, the members simply don't vote for it. So how much power do the parties actually have?
Not as much as in parliamentary systems, and I should mention that the very first paper I wrote when I started this research now about 20 years ago had the title "The Inefficient Secret," and that's an allusion to Bagehot, I guess, who wrote this history of the English Constitution, which he called the system you just described the efficient secret. And it turns out that Van Buren, this is the interesting thing about intellectual history. Van Buren is developing theories about caucus government at the same time Anglophile parliaments are coming up with solutions to this problem of getting together coalitions. And it's very clear that Van Buren wanted the caucus to be a binding caucus on policy. And Van Buren tries it and he fails. And there end up being times in the 1890s, the 1920s. We've seen in more recent history attempts to create binding caucuses. And sometimes there's like a little flash in the pan, like in the teens with the Democrats, but then they go away. So the binding caucus on policy, which was a gleam in Van Buren's eye, is the one part of the Van Buren plan that never got enacted, but everything else did. And we could talk at length about that, but certainly Van Buren wanted to go there and he couldn't get it. Yeah.
If I can have a follow-up. Tom Reed resigned the speakership. Speaker Boehner resigned the speakership. Could either of them survived given their particular personalities and political ideas?
Could they have survived without resigning?
Right. And could they have been effective in the House of Representatives?
Yeah, of course, Tom Reed was a little before my time, so Reed's problem was with the administration, right, in a disagreement about policy. Whereas, Boehner, it seems to me, in some ways was similar. That is, the party was divided about policy, but it seemed to be a bit more of an inside baseball type of thing. I wasn't on the Hill at the time, so I don't know if Boehner could have survived. But it does strike me that he didn't want to survive, and that was probably good enough. But I don't have a good answer to that question.
Wasn't he elected speaker as a freshman?
So the question about Clay being elected as speaker as a freshman. Yes, he was elected speaker the very first day he was a member of the House. Now, keep in mind, he had been Speaker of the Kentucky legislature, and he had been a U.S. Senator a couple of times, so he wasn't exactly a neophyte. Likewise, Pennington was elected Speaker in his first term as well, although Pennington had been the governor of New Jersey, and in fact, I didn't get into the details, but although he was a neophyte in the House of Representatives, actually he was the key player in this disputed election case involving New Jersey when he had been the governor of New Jersey. So he was well aware of kind of organizational things in the House. But yeah, no, Clay was definitely a different guy, special guy.
We're going to ask you to speak into the microphone so we can capture you on tape.
So it seems like a lot of what we're talking about today is this kind of the centralized power. The fascination with the speakership is because there's a lot of power centralized in the office. Particular, like you have a very kind of top-down structure. That necessarily wasn't always the case. Committees have also been incredibly powerful throughout the course of the history of the House, as speakers have delegated powers to the individual chairman. And in the 19th century, in particular, how powerful, in your opinion, was the office of the speaker? Yeah. Especially kind of in this, well, up to when Clay becomes speaker, and then especially after Clay becomes speaker.
Yeah, that's a whole other book, and in fact, we address some of that in our book. I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I think you've described well what kind of the conventionally believed by the House, and I think there's a lot of truth to it. Having said that, one of the things that's really striking in looking at the history is that the members act as if, even during the period where we know just observationally, that the committees sometimes will just do just wildly unpredictable things, that the speaker elections proceed as if the speaker is a dictator, which is really kind of striking, even when you know. And in fact, a little bit bibliography here. James Sterling Young wrote The Washington Community, which is one of the most famous books in congressional history. And he has a great chapter section about Henry Clay, in which he says, Clay is seen as being, the father of American parliamentary power, but he got, they wiped the floor with him so many times. He lost so many things. He couldn't stack committees to save his life. I mean, it's all sorts of failures, and yet he is held up as being the strong speaker in the antebellum period. And maybe that's why he kept getting reelected, is that he actually was a weak speaker. So, but there is this. Yes. So you're right. Observationally, the committees are weak, but they're fighting tooth and nail over this position. So either they're diluted, or there are things still worthwhile in being speaker. As Mel Brooks once said, it's good being king. And I think, if nothing else, you did get some things as speaker. Oh, yes.
I believe our time has about expired. We want to give Charles another really round of applause for a really erudite and informative presentation. Thank you for attending.
Buy the book if you need help sleeping.